tonight is that the two candidates will have to address it to each other, with each other, in person on stage, as opposed to via surrogates and via emailed statements and that sort of thing. Aside from that, I'm curious how much they will get into the substance of what Sanders allegedly said, the substance at the center of this discussion, which is sexism in politics. You know, voters have been saying to us throughout this campaign that they are at the very least nervous about whether or not a woman can be elected against Donald Trump in 2020. So, to the extent that we get a frank discussion of sexism in politics on that stage, that could be something interesting and something new.
I mean, we should also point out that this is a fight, or a rift, we should say, that some progressive organizations don't want to see happening. You know, they have seen Sanders and Warren really lead, they feel, on progressive issues this campaign cycle. The two candidates have largely been in agreement on things, and they worry that any sort of rift between them, especially on the debate stage, might help a candidate like Joe Biden or Pete Buttigieg, who they see as a more moderate candidate in the field.
There are other candidates, of course. What are you watching for from them?
Well, one is Pete Buttigieg, who is doing very well in Iowa. He is in that top sort of bunch of four candidates here. And he is doing better here polling-wise than he is nationally. He has a great organization here, and he may be very happy to just watch Sanders and Warren fight it out, and Sanders and Biden fight it out, and to try to fly under the radar. So that's possible. One other is Amy Klobuchar, senator from a neighboring state here. She hasn't been getting a whole lot of traction in the polls, but she has been working hard to hit as much of Iowa as possible, to hit every county. And she's gotten a lot of attention in that last debate, especially where she got more time to break through.
And lastly, you know, we should mention Tom Steyer. I do think it was surprising to some folks that he qualified for this debate, and in part he saw an increase in his poll numbers because he's been spending a lot of money on TV ads. So, you know, you can expect that this is an attack line we're going to see from progressives, you know, questioning whether or not a candidate can essentially, quote-unquote, buy their way into this race.
That's NPR's Asma Khalid and Danielle Kurtzleben in Des Moines, Iowa. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
After U.S. drone strikes killed a top Iranian commander, Iran responded in part by further backing away from the nuclear deal it agreed to in 2015. Under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, Iran agreed to limits on its nuclear program and opened its doors to international inspectors. The goal, to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. But in 2018, the Trump administration pulled the U.S. out of the agreement and reimposed sanctions on Iran. So now Britain, France, and Germany are trying to salvage the deal and focus Iran back into compliance. But the agreement was already hanging by a thread. It's according to Sanam Vakil of Chatham House, a London-based international affairs think tank. We spoke to her earlier.
They're unhappy because of Iran's breaches, and they also believe that they have to not just protect the deal, which was a multilateral agreement negotiated over a prolonged period of time, some people say a decade. They also have to protect the principle of non-proliferation. So they are pushing back against Iran by beginning a process that has been clearly delineated in the Iran nuclear agreement to resolve conflicts. But worst case scenario, it could end up in the return of EU sanctions against Iran.
What tools do they have left? What leverage do they have left over Iran?
I don't think that they have many tools at their disposal. What they do have is the ability to talk to both sides, to lobby them that a nuclear crisis is really not the end game here. The goal was to prevent Iran from pursuing a nuclear program. But beyond that, also Europe has not been able to deliver Washington more delivered Iran.
For a while, it seemed like there was some attempt to try to keep the U.S. back into the deal. But now we are hearing this from British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, the BBC.
My point to our American friends is, look, somehow or other, we've got to stop the Iranians acquiring a nuclear weapon. But if we're going to get rid of it, let's replace it. And let's replace it with the Trump deal.
So obviously there's still an attempt to try and get the U.S. back to the table. But what does Johnson mean when he talks about the Trump deal?
I think Boris Johnson is pointing to President Trump's desire to have his own stamp on a deal with Iran. He's merely suggesting, let's tweak this agreement a little. Let's make it a bigger, better Trump deal.
And so how do you think this is going over in Iran?
The big question in Tehran right now is, what can Europe actually do in this moment? From Iran's perspective, attention, to raise some eyebrows, to show the world that this strategy has actually been a complete failure.
Is this JCPOA, is this nuclear deal dead, moot? What's the status now?
It is dying. It's not completely dead yet. I think the problem here is that there's not a lot of that the remaining signatories can do to save the deal. The problems over the JCPOA really remain between the Trump administration and Iran. Iran is willing to come back to the negotiating table if the Trump administration provides it an off-ramp, some form of economic concession or sanctions relief. And the Trump administration, in this current climate, sees Iran as weakened, sees its policy as being positive and successful. We're seeing protests in Iran. We're seeing Iran back-footed in the region. And I don't think that they're likely to shift their positions. So we're in a bit of a stalemate period. Everybody is playing for time, but it does look ultimately that without any bold moves from the Iranians or from the Trump administration, that the JCPOA unfortunately will die.
That's Sanam Bakil. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me on, Adi.
The Food and Drug Administration is approving drugs more quickly than ever. Some researchers say this faster action comes with a trade-off, less reliable evidence. NPR health correspondent Sydney Lupkin reports.
The FDA is approving more new drugs than ever, and it's doing this faster than in previous decades. This is according to a new study published in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association. About 30 years ago, it took almost 3 years for the FDA to approve a new drug, and by 2018, it had dropped to a little over 10 months. But there may be a downside. Here's lead study author Jonathan Darrow of Harvard Medical School.
There has been a gradual erosion of the evidence that's required for FDA approval.
The agency has added programs to allow it to approve drugs based on fewer clinical trials. The FDA also relied on more things like lab tests and scans. For cancer, that might mean testing whether a drug shrinks tumors instead of whether it improves survival after treatment. Darrow says that may mean new, expensive drugs aren't necessarily better than the drugs already on the market.
Patients who are seeking treatment from their physicians should recognize that there's greater uncertainty with the new drugs, and they may want to ask whether an older drug is available that might do just as well in this particular case.
Dr. Joshua Sharfstein was FDA Principal Deputy Commissioner during the Obama administration. He says there's a sense in Congress that to get more cures on the market, you need to offer drug makers incentives.
In some cases, that may actually help, great products make it through. In other cases, it may be lowering the standards for evidence in a way and making it actually less likely that doctors and patients will know whether products work.
Sharfstein wrote an accompanying editorial in JAMA about the study.
We've kind of reached a point where it makes sense to pause and see whether we can do things better, and I think we can.
He offered several suggestions for change. For example, Congress needs to reevaluate FDA expedited approval programs to see what's working and what's driving up healthcare costs. Sydney Lupkin, NPR News.
You're listening to All Things Considered.
African American neighborhoods are hotter and less healthful than white neighborhoods due to a lack of trees.
It was very surprising when we saw that it was a pattern that we were seeing consistently across the country.
And it turns out the disparity dates back to discriminatory housing policies from the 1930s. A closer look in 20 minutes on WHYY's All Things Considered.
I'm Carol Hills. In 2014, a revolution seemed to change everything in Ukraine.
The changes that happened, they are really irreversible. It was like a civilizational shift, if you want.
But today, Ukraine is under a lot of pressure. It's at war with Russia. It's also at the center of the U.S. impeachment saga. A Ukrainian politician weighs in on her country's future. Next time on The World.
Tune in for The World this evening from 8 to 9 on WHYY.
Supporting WHYY, the Annenberg Center, inviting listeners to celebrate the extraordinary legacy of dance icon Paul Taylor, January 24th through the 25th at the Annenberg Center. In honor of Taylor's impact and tremendous repertoire, the Paul Taylor Dance Company will perform a program of beloved masterpieces, including Syzygy, Sunset, and Piazzolla Caldera. Tickets for Paul Taylor Dance Company, January 24th through the 25th at annenbergcenter.org.
After more than a year and a half of a trade war, there is a deal of sorts set to be signed.
Well, I don't think it's the beginning of the end of the trade war. I think it's a beginning of some stabilization, we hope.
I'm Kai Risdall. What the trade war has done to this economy. Next time on Marketplace.
Stay with WHYY for Marketplace this evening from 6:30 to 7 on WHYY.
Support for NPR comes from this station and from Subaru with the 2020 Subaru Forester, featuring standard symmetrical all-wheel drive and safety technology. Love, it's what makes Subaru Subaru. Learn more at Subaru.com. From Procter & Gamble, maker of Align, a daily probiotic supplement containing a gastroenterologist-developed strain to support digestive health. Learn more at AlignProbiotics.com. And from the listeners who support this NPR station.
This is All Things Considered from NPR News. I'm Ari Shapiro.
And I'm Audie Cornish. Wisconsin's multi-billion-dollar deal with Taiwanese manufacturer Foxconn is the most expensive tax incentive package a state has ever given a foreign company. But whether government incentives for businesses are money well spent is up for debate. Wisconsin Public Radio's Laurel White explains in the last of 3 stories on Foxconn.
The debate over American particularly tax-free for businesses in New Jersey. He thought it would help create more manufacturing jobs. Today, states and cities are still offering tax breaks and sometimes cash payments to companies, sports teams, or even movie productions in exchange for jobs. Companies like Foxconn.
That breaking news after months of speculation, Foxconn promises to build its first American factory here in Wisconsin.
Critics of the more than $3 billion deal argue it's too pricey and too risky for taxpayers. Tim Bartik is a senior economist at the W.E. Upjohn Institute for Employment Research. He's been studying business incentives for more than 20 years.
It's not clear to me that the voters really understand that it's have a cost and that they're not a free lunch. I think people get lost in the details of the arguments over benefits and costs of incentives.
Bartik's research shows that a new factory doesn't always translate to a job for an unemployed person living nearby. It's more likely people will move to the area for the jobs, with local government picking up the cost of serving those new residents.
It's going to have to either increase someone's taxes by that amount, or it's going to have to cut public spending on something.
Bartik says the number of these deals across the country has tripled since 1990, and some of them, like the one between the state of Illinois and Motorola in 1997, haven't turned out so well.
I'm standing at the edge of this big manufacturing facility. They have these narrow gates up. They're blocked with chains. And on the right, there are 2 big gray buildings. This place has been sitting empty for 16 years.
Most academic literature is very skeptical of these incentives.
That's Nate Jensen, who studies incentive deals at the University of Texas at Austin. He's studied hundreds of deals and says most can be boiled down to 2 main points.